Hello, everyone, and welcome to Diversity Matters, where we explore all things diversity, equity, and inclusion related. I'm your host, Oscar Holmes IV, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Enobong, who everyone affectionately calls Anna, to the guest chair today, as we talk about striving for the American dream and the DEI backlash we are facing in this moment. A professor of sociology, Anna received her PhD from the University at Albany, SUNY, and started her academic career at UMass Amherst prior to joining Rutgers University, where she serves as the Senior Vice President for Equity. In this role, she provides strategic leadership to ensure that the institutional commitment to equity is reflected in the research, educational, and public engagement efforts that occur throughout the university, and the focus extends to faculty, staff, and students. She is a highly sought-after national expert on diversity in the academy. Dr. Branch serves on several advisory boards that aim to advance inclusive excellence within professional societies. Dr. Anna Branch, welcome to Diversity Matters.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to have this conversation.
We'll be back after a quick word from our sponsors.
The African American Chamber of Commerce of New Jersey is dedicated to economically empowering and sustaining African American communities and businesses through entrepreneurship and capitalistic initiatives throughout the state of New Jersey. While providing a collective voice for New Jersey's African American business leaders, the AACC-NJ advocates and promotes economic diversity while fostering a climate of growth through major initiatives on the educational and public policy levels.
I had the joy, pleasure, and privilege to call Anna a Rutgers colleague, and I directly benefit from the DEI work that she leads at Rutgers. And for that, I want to give you your flowers now and say thank you so much for the hard work that you do. I'm looking forward to learning even more from you in our conversation today. So Anna, let's get started. So you didn't know this, but you and I both went to college as biology pre-med majors, thinking we wanted to be a physician, but later pivoted to what I think is our actual calling. And so can you tell us a little bit about your professional journey of how you went from a bio pre-med major at Howard to the first Senior Vice President for Equity at Rutgers University?
So funny that you should describe it as my calling. I'm always evolving, and so I don't necessarily know what's next. And so biology, when I was in it, and for folks who knew me as a kid, it was a doctor all the way, 100%. I grew up in the Bronx, and the Bronx is the poorest borough in New York City. I've gone to private schools my whole life. And so I knew the impact of education, but I kind of took for granted education in that way. And I went to Howard, and bio pre-med was the largest major at Howard. Everybody was in bio. And so coming and going through Howard, I knew I would have amazing friends that were lawyers and doctors, tons of those. I knew much fewer that were teachers, and even less who were really committed to making sure the next generation of us made it to Howard. And so I went back and I taught in the Bronx for 2 years. Not the planned, complete shift of course. And I was in a program called Learning Disabilities at Teachers College, Columbia. What I loved about that is the disabilities was lowercase DIS, capital A for ability. Right? The problem for a person with disabilities wasn't the disability, but it was the social construction of normality. And that was a completely different way of looking at the world for a bio major. Right, and the medical model of the world, right, that problems were to be fixed, right, to kind of reinforce this idea of normal. And I love the classroom, and I love this idea of kind of playing with how do we make it better for everyone. But at the end of the day, the problem wasn't my classroom. And that was the solution for an educated program or education program. And that's how I ended up pivoting to sociology. And sociology was a chance to kind of look at the world more broadly, to understand the social conditions that created Black poverty, that created the education outcomes that we were kind of seeing in urban schools in New York City. So that was my evolution. And I thought I was going to go back to the Bronx, work in private schools, or become a superintendent, right? That was originally the path. And while I was in graduate school, I had friends and my advisor who said, you'd be a great college professor. And I was like, what? Right? That was not the plan. And that kind of the rest is history. That's how it started. And it's true, when I was teaching, I taught middle and high school. My favorite students were my high schoolers, right? My seniors, right before they were about to leave me. And so in some ways, I followed them to college. And I taught at UMass Amherst for 12 years before coming to Rutgers. Being at UMass Amherst and in my graduate program, it really was a world outside of an HBCU. And HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, Black talent is expected, it is celebrated. It is held up. It's never questioned. And coming to graduate school, it's like, oh, it's an interesting experience, but I was very clear on who I was, so that wasn't a problem. But becoming a professor, I saw my students struggle. I saw my colleagues struggle. And then being a tenure track professor, it's a very different side, right? Even if you know who you are, it's a very, very different experience. And so I got interested, even as an assistant professor, in, well, what does it look like to build community that sustains us? And so I started projects then. I ran a project called Supporting Faculty of Color Through Tenure and Beyond, through some amazing support from the institution and things like that. And so I kind of had this taste for administration. I came out of administration when I was in middle and high school. I never intended to do it this early. And I never intended to do it around diversity, right? I was supporting myself, right? And those like me, but got really frustrated by the fact that institutions recruited and said they valued and wanted students and faculty of color, but didn't really do any of the work of retention beyond recruitment, right? It was like, you're here, yay, thrive. That's not how it works when institutions weren't made for us. And I'm pretty vocal. And so my critiques got me the job. And I didn't intend for that to be the job. And so it's been one happy accident after another to be in roles and spaces that aim to ask the question, what would it actually take to create environments where folks can thrive intentionally, right? Not just by happy accident and not just because we retained ourselves, but that we actually put in work in institutional investment in retaining and building community. So that's my journey. Again, not a straight line at all.
It's so funny because we also have something else in common. I also taught high school as well before landing into academia. It was public school for me. But I also like what you said about maybe not necessarily being your calling. I feel like this work is my calling that I do, but I am really cognizant that it's not my only calling. And I always tell people I have several authentic selves. And so I'm also looking forward to my next chapter as well. So I'm glad that you pointed that out. And for our listeners out there, we can have many, many callings and we have many authentic selves. But I'm just so fortunate that I get to pursue something that I love. And I know you love this work as well.
That's absolutely it.
So let's stay in Bronx for a little while because I want to talk a little bit more about your background. And is it the case that it was your father's school that you worked at, or was it another school? Because I think I read something about your father forming a school.
Absolutely. It was my father's school. So as a kid, I couldn't stand this at all. But every time I went up a grade, my father, let me step back and kind of tell the story from the beginning. So my father had a PhD in sociology and economics, and he was actually a college professor. But he left education at the higher education level to start a school when I was school age, because I was in the Bronx, as I mentioned. And there were a host of challenges with our kind of neighborhood schools. And he said, nope, not mine. And so the school started. And each year that I added a grade, the school kind of kept growing and growing all the way through. And it was a terrific school. I had an amazing education. But as I went to college and came back and was looking at it, I saw new challenges that were emerging there. And going back was an opportunity to help and make it better. So yeah, it was my dad's school. It was complete, not at all what I intended to do. Not at all. But it was amazing. And I was really thrilled to be able to support and give back in that way.
Well, that's so amazing. And go dad. I mean, that's talking about a trailblazer. So I've already mentioned that you're at Rutgers University, first ever senior vice president for equity. However, another important historical milestone is that you were promoted into the role at Rutgers by our first ever African-American president, Dr. Jonathan Holloway. So share with us what significance that has and any unique lessons about leadership that you have learned being seated at the table in this moment.
Such a great question and so many dimensions to it. So let's start at the beginning. So President Holloway started in July 2020. And let's go back to that moment, right? We were in the middle, kind of the height of the racial reckoning. At that time, kind of going even before then that spring, there were multiple Black presidents named that spring. So there was really a lot of excitement and energy in higher education about, wow, this could really be a different moment for a different kind of leadership to emerge. And I think one of the interesting things, jumping to lessons, and I'll go back into the details, is when we have models of leadership that are uniform, right? The bodies that are leadership that are uniform, there are things that we attribute then to those bodies, right? And then visions, new visions that we hope to attribute to new bodies. I think one of the lessons is that it's not just about the bodies, but it's about the actions. And I think the set of challenges we've seen across higher education, presidents who've risen, fallen, a host of challenges, kind of remind us of the importance of not just the bodies and the seats, but also the uniqueness of the challenges that come for those bodies, right? And I think we've seen some of that at Rutgers for sure. But kind of going back to the beginning, one of the things that was amazing, why I was excited about the role, was there was a moment of possibility, right? Not just for him, but for the institution, right? What this meant. And the beginning, one of the things he did in one of his first kind of speeches or writings to the campus community was he named two pandemics. I thought that was really powerful and important for the community to kind of come in the door that way. He said, we're dealing with COVID-19, right? Unprecedented challenges. And we're dealing with the racial reckoning. We're dealing with racism. Racism, not just the public health crisis, but racism, the way that shape our institutions. He was able to make that connection. So I think that was really powerful and important. The thing that I think I was most excited about was he named and came to the door and asked for something called an equity audit. And that was before I was named the Senior Vice President for Equity. I was in another role at the time. And I asked, what is that? What do you want that to do? I want to know, right? Where is the institution on these things that matter to me? And I think that within the first 6 weeks, that project was completed by September. We started in July. And it was a self-assessment, the senior leadership, and a perception survey of the broader campus alongside some metrics. And so we started at the very beginning with a really deep sense of, oh, where the institution is, and oh, there's some challenges. And I remember putting that together and thinking, oh, this is going to be a lot of work for somebody. And then that somebody became me, right? He created, University Equity and Inclusion. He created my role as Senior Vice President for Equity. And part of what he would say when he was asked about why all this attention to diversity, and I appreciated the answer was, it wasn't just about diversity because he was Black or because I was Black, but it was about an investment and the strategy for the university, that where we are in the state of New Jersey, where the country is in terms of the K-12 population, if we aren't intentional about creating environments that allow people of diverse backgrounds to thrive in higher education is going to be in trouble. So that sense of leadership, that willingness to use your authority, to not worry so much about what will people think if I do this as the first, to kind of come in with it, I think was really instructive, right? It was a really amazing model of leadership. And then I think I want to end with where I started around the troubles of identity in leadership. And it's that you can't take anything for granted, right? That's the point I was making, that it's not just about who's in the seat, because initial momentum can wane due to unprecedented challenges. I think over the last 4 years, like I said, we started with the pandemic and we thought, oh, that's going to be an unprecedented challenge. And almost every single year since, right? We've been watching new sorts of challenges unfold. And so the idea that it's not about a single leader or a sole set of challenges, pandemic, the first strike in workers' history, the current global war, right? And the global humanitarian crisis that's unfolding in Gaza, you name it. College campuses are ground zero for a whole host of challenges that create unprecedented challenges for leaders with the best of intentions, with the best of leadership teams. They're really challenging to grapple with. And so I've really appreciated the space that's been created to keep moving forward, because in my space, one of the things that we've emphasized a lot is directionality and progress. We called our diversity strategic plan Rutgers Forward. And we started our planning process in the middle of the pandemic. And when we're doing it, the response from many was, this is a horrible time, right? It's the pandemic, no one can focus. And we held our first progress summit last November. And one of the things we said then was, if we waited for the future time that was better, we would have never started. And every moment since then has kind of affirmed that truth, right? That there isn't going to be a better, more optimal time to focus on issues of diversity. And as a president, there's never going to be a time to focus on what others might consider soft issues, right? And so I really appreciated that as a new president in a new place, that he came in and said, no, I want to focus on this, right? At a time, and invest in it, right? At a time that the institution was having much broader financial challenges like other places too. And so really, there's been a host of lessons around how to lead. But I'd say that the one about helping an institution set a direction and sticking with it is the one I'll keep with me.
Excellent. That is so amazing. And I definitely hope listeners hear what you're saying in terms about the context of leadership, because I think so many people are fascinated with this idea. If I just get this perfect person in a role, that everything is going to be great, or we just need to move this person out of the role and get someone else. And it's like, these are going to be some unprecedented challenges and issues that anyone is going to face. And so I think people need to give space and grace, particularly if you've never sat in that seat or not even close to anywhere sitting in that seat, to understand the challenges that people make and the tough decisions that they have to make day in and day out. But, you are a sociologist, trained as a sociologist, so you are used to grand challenges and have dedicated your life to trying to solve some of these problems. So you've written several books, but today I want to talk just a little bit about one of your latest books that you co-authored with Dr. Caroline Hanley, Work in Black and White, Striving for the American Dream. And so I guess a broader question, first question is, what inspired you to write the book, and what do you hope readers can get from reading this book?
One of the things, Carolyn and I have been working together for almost 15 years, right? A long time over a series of projects. And the question of how do we understand labor market inequality has kind of been a persistent question for us. We tackled it in a lot of different ways. The goal for this project was to ask, well, how do workers themselves understand it? Because it's one thing for us to document it in trends and to talk to you about how long it took. Again, we worked on a project for a long time. That was a series of papers, but the idea was upgraded to bad jobs, right? That Black woman coming out of domestic service, which was the majority job category for them through the 1960s, household labor, right? It was a labor market transformation to do anything else, right? Post 1970, which is really late compared to everyone else who had a much broader set of occupational options. And so, yes, you saw labor market change. Yes, you saw improvement for them. But again, they were upgraded to bad jobs, right? Not good jobs. Well, fast forward to the 2000 plus era, and we have a completely transformed economy, right? A very different kind of skill biased technological change. So we have good jobs, I'll say in air quotes, right? So a growing proportion of jobs that require some education. If you've got those skills, you're well positioned to do better. And in this new labor market, new economy, the old, outdated ideas, again in air quotes, as some would have us believe race is in America, should not. Right? Education is king. And we're good. We're good now. And we wanted to test that theory because we knew from the data that wasn't true, right? We could see all sorts of ways that there was continuity in inequality and the ways that Black women in particular, who had been historically disadvantaged in the labor market, continued to be. But it's one thing for me to tell you a data table or show you a data table. And it's another thing to hear how workers themselves understand it. So did they understand what we were seeing was one of the questions, right? And work in Black and white is a play on words in some sense. What does work mean, right, in Black and white, right? So how do they understand it literally on the page? But also, what does work mean for Black and white workers, right? In Black and white, are there differences in their experiences, literally? I think there's always within group racial conversations about opportunity, because one of the things that was happening in the economic sector, right, post 2000, is we started to experience serial recessions, right, which weren't things that we understood in the pre-2000 labor market in the same way. So the idea of stability, right, the idea that our parents had, that you would get a job and you'd work in that job, right, for your lifetime, really shifted in the post-2000 labor market. So how do we understand that? Who do we blame? Right? What are we doing with those ideas? And the American dream as a question, what does it mean now? Because it was premised on the idea that I could have a job, work really hard, get that job, and be okay. The American dream didn't account for hiccups, right? It actually didn't account for racism, right? It was just an idea, right, that was held out. And so our goal was to put those things in the conversations and be asked a really specific group of people. Interested in workers between 35 and 55, because they were the folks who came of age under that other ideal. This vision of if I get a job and I get that job and I work hard, I'll be okay. And we're interested in people who had some education, so who made the investments, who thought, I'm going to be okay. And between 35 and 55, they settled in a little bit, right? You had some idea of what direction you were going in by then. And so they'd be best positioned to reflect a little bit, and reflect they did.
So I'm going to take us into higher ed. And one of the things that I think trouble me sometimes, that I think connects with your book about the perception that people have around the American dream and how we work, is, to me, sometimes expectation that if we focus on first generation students, that is going to be the panacea. And I think that it's a potential mistake when we try to just focus on first generation students, because first generation to me is not the same thing across racial groups. And that's, I think, is really important that we take that into account, because even as you talk about your story, your father, who had a PhD, so very highly educated. But as you mentioned, when you came into the academy, you experienced some very different things. And thankfully, I have a very privileged, blessed life. Many of my neighbors, I live in a neighborhood where many of my white neighbors don't have a college degree at all. And just because they don't have a college degree does not mean that they're living in poverty at all. By no means, they're not living in poverty. And so even when we have white students who be first generation, that does not mean the same thing as a Black or Hispanic or, Latinx first generation student. And what I like about your book is you draw that connection between what work is like for just Black and white. It's different. And so I may be the only person who have this thought. And as a sociologist, I'm interested to hear your thoughts about, again, how we are conflating first generation or seeing it as a panacea when there are strictly racial things that makes these groups distinct. So what say you?
Oh, man, what a question. So I'll start by affirming why we need to focus on first generation, and then I'll trouble it a bit. First generation status matters because there are rules of the academy that we take for granted being in. So things like office hours. If you've never been to college, the concept of an office hour is a strange one. Why am I going to meet with this person if I don't have a question or have a need? But the idea that you want to build a relationship with a professor, that you want to think about how do I invest in a relationship so that maybe down the line when I apply to something else, I know that I can get a reference letter from you. First generation, literally not even on the radar screen. Or the idea that what I do with my professor or the professor's perception of me, my level of engagement, may have some bearing on both how I am assessed, their willingness to support me. There's a whole range of gray areas that have to do with college success that are taught, right? Or even just the ability to have someone say, I don't understand this. What's the drop period? What's the consequences of withdrawal? There's a whole other language of college that if you haven't been through it, that you can get stuck, you can withdraw or drop out prematurely. Whereas if you were just given a little bit of support, a little bit of awareness that it's not just you, you'd be okay. I'll use the sociology example, then I'll come back to the troubling question. I got my PhD in sociology, but my undergrad degree was in biology. And so I'd never taken sociology class. I took one online, but I'd not taken one in the classroom. And I'm in my theory class. Everyone's talking about labor. And again, biology, right? I can name elements. OChem was my favorite, but I had never heard of this person, Weber. And I was a studious student. I did all my reading. In my syllabus, I did not see the name Weber. I was very, very confused. But I'm listening along. The class is going. People are having a deeply passionate discussion. I'm like, did I read the right thing? I'm very confused. And then the professor says at some point, a very common mistake is for people to pronounce Weber as Weber. And I was like, oh my God, like light bulbs went off right in my head because it is spelled Weber, like the grill. Okay? Somewhere along the way, people learned and knew. Everyone else in my class knew. I didn't know. Again, I'm not first generation, but that's a first generation moment, right? Of what is that thing that everybody else knows that I don't, and I'm losing time questioning whether I belong, whether I understand. That is a shared first generation experience. Now, the part that's not shared is that everything about college has to do with class markers. And there are class markers that are shared in the same way, whether or not first generation status is. So we can't take those things for granted either. But I want to come back to race, ethnicity, and identity specifically, because I think one of the things that happens in college environments is that college doesn't escape or sidestep the broader ills of American society, which don't attribute intelligence broadly to students of color, particularly Black and Latinx students. And that has actually nothing to do with first generation status, right? That's literally just an identity bias, a stereotype. And so if you come in the door thinking, oh, it's just about knowing the things and not managing the ways in which you will be challenged, the way that your literal presence in a space will be questioned, what hostility looks like in conversations, Those, again, have nothing to do with being first generation, but have everything to do with what it looks like to be Black in a place of higher learning. And so we actually need to attend to all of those things.
Exactly.
Right? Which is why work and investments in diversity matter so much, because if it's not your experience, you take it for granted. Right? You assume everyone's getting the same support when they come to college. Everyone's welcome when they knock on the professor's door. Everyone's comfortable. No, everyone is not. Some people are questioned when they knock on the door and asked, why are you here? As opposed to like, oh yeah, you're student X in class Y. Right? And so those nuances really matter. And to say nothing of representation. Right? And so numbers matter. But belonging, the sense of this is a place where I can fit, matters. And when you don't see yourself, when people aren't used to seeing you, the tendency to make you a stand-in for all assumptions, all things, grows so much more. So yes, I agree. On one end, the first generation panacea doesn't work as a simplistic Band-Aid, but it has to be one of the tools in the toolkit when we think about what will it take for students to thrive.
I absolutely agree with your response, and so glad that you gave us that very, very nuanced understanding of how we should think about this issue and topic. And these are things that are kind of outside of what a lot of people think about, because they do take a lot of things for granted. And so additionally, in your book, you talk about marriage rates and the difference in marriage rates. And a lot of people may think, well, what does that have to do with the American dream? What does that have to do with people's standings? But it has a lot to do with from your research. And so can you talk about how important just this concept of marriage is and how can it affect people's idea of their American dream?
I absolutely will. But can I go back for a moment? Because I want to talk a bit about education, right? So this conversation we're just having, one of the things, even before you get to marriage, is the idea that education itself will be the panacea. So first generation is the institutional response. This is how we think about who we support. And first generation is this umbrella and yay, everything's great. But the second part, kind of culturally, that we've done in America is yes, there's vast inequalities, but education will take them away. And if you invest in education, everything will be fine. That's not true, right? One of the challenges that we note in the book really clearly, we find lots of others have found it, is this idea, and that we tell students this, right? Go to college, and absolutely go to college. But college in and of itself, for all the things we were just talking about before, isn't going to solve it completely. One of the most distressing findings from the book is that Black women with terminal degrees, in some instances, we have kind of an average table set, drawing on the US population as a whole, can earn as much as white men with some college. So that educational investment, right, at the highest levels, with the debt to accompany it, right, didn't reflect in terms of the economics, dollars and cents security that we would expect, looking at the average populations for both of those. The average of Black women with terminal degrees, PhDs, JDs, MDs, those kinds, and white men with some college, reflects different opportunity sets, different professional choices that white men with some college have access to, regardless of education, right? That Black women needed terminal degrees to attain. So the structure of opportunity in America isn't just about education. And so we have this story that says kids need to go to college, and they do. We need high levels of education for the economy that we're in, no question. But college isn't enough by itself. We're asking schools to solve the problems of American inequality that they did not create. And schools, in many ways, are reproducing the inequality that we see. So I gotta address schools and education, right? That simple notion that just go to school and school will fix it. Marriage, coming back to that question, really interesting concept in the sense that when we go back historically, we can really see the ways that marriage was assumed as an economic benefit. So for white families, never applied to Black families. For white families, the idea of a family wage for men was the ideal, that you earned enough to support a wife and children. Again, expectations for Black women was always that they worked. And so then Black men didn't need a family wage, right? So those notions meant that from a long time, we're talking pre-Civil Rights Act, the economic differences between Black and white men in particular were large. And then between Black men and Black women, white men, right? We talk about wage and gender gaps. So we know these things intellectually, right? But that idea of a family wage made an assumption about marriage as kind of an economic benefit. and not the same benefit for Black men and women. They had to be married to each other for their two salaries to equal up to the one, all right, of the white family wage. So when you have two household families and the assumption of marriage as a constant, then okay, what's so terrible about that? We don't have those assumptions anymore. And so it's not only that we don't have the assumptions that marriage will be ubiquitous or that it will last, right, through a lifetime, it's that the rates differ dramatically. So white men have the highest marriage rates, right, in the kind of 80s, right, in terms of percentile. And Black women have the lowest marriage rates in the mid 40s. Now, put that with those stats I was just talking about, right, with white men having the highest earnings on average. Black women have the lowest earnings on average. In terms of partner trends, race matching is still a thing. This is not discounting the relationships of same-sex households, but kind of thinking about those trends as a whole, you're just going to see stark differences. So two male households are going to be better off, right, than two female households in terms of economic trends. But that's the other kind of compounded fact that we saw in our data when we talked to people, right? We talked to 79 people, white and Black men, white and Black women. And one of the striking facts of the people that we spoke to is that the Black women we met, like in the national data, were the highest educated across all three groups, all four groups, including them. They were the least economically secure, right? They earned less than everybody else. And the vulnerability of them to challenges that would kind of change economic position was the highest. White women were the lowest educated of our group and the most economically secure on average because they were married. So that the ability to have a second household, again, post-1970 and onward, Americans have relied on two earners or dual earners to kind of sustain lifestyle. And when you don't have access to that, or you're making it up a different kind of way, it has a real impact, but it's a kind of silent maintainer of inequality. And that until we grapple with and get to a place of equal pay for equal work, right, getting at gender challenges, we kind of miss this kind of underside of the broader sets of challenges and reasons, which is a completely different set of conversations around why the marriage rates are what they are. But it's a really important undercurrent that's there.
Excellent, excellent. I always say if you deal with the issues that plague the Black community, then you will improve inclusion for all groups. And I think our research shows that. But I want to give you the opportunity, just because someone may say, as they listen to this, well, what about me? I don't fall in the binary Black-white. How does it apply to me? And again, I will restate, if you deal with issues that affect Black people, you're going to always improve situations for other people as well. But what say you about that if someone say, well, why you just focus on Black-white, and what about all these other groups?
So interesting. I love the question. And it's one that we address squarely in the book. I totally encourage the listeners to check it out. But it's the idea of the composition of the American labor market as a kind of step back, right? I'll tell you why you should care too, but let's step back. The American labor market is largely a Black-white story, right? More than 85%, even as late as 2000. And so while it's true in places like New Jersey, California, and Florida, the labor market can look a lot more complex, right? Much larger populations of Asians and Latinos. As a whole, they did not make up more than 15% of the labor market in America, right? Until recently. And so when we talk about the kind of legacy of slavery, Jim Crow segregation, the ways that it shaped access to opportunity and narratives around who deserves it, that's why we focus on the Black-white story. It's really important. But if you're not Black or white, why do you care? One of the things I think is interesting that you hear in their stories is that all groups play a role in sustaining the myth of America. The promise, the possibility of America is this is a place where you can come with nothing and become anything. Right? That is a promise of America. But notice what I said, start with nothing and become anything. That's actually different than the American dream. The American dream's premise is you can work hard and pull yourself up and you'll be okay. That part's not true. So one of the things that happens in America is for groups that are able to come to America and to pursue better opportunities and to realize their ambition, they can look at Black Americans and say, well, what's wrong with you? Our group did it. And what's missed is the broader set of sticky economic and cultural factors. So we talk about things like education and access. We talk about schooling and neighborhoods. And so when we just step back and say, well, it's just if they would just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, if they would just lean into personal responsibility like we did, it'll all be good. What we see in America is a cross-section for a whole host of other groups that we don't see for Black America, who are still grappling as a whole. We're seeing the whole Black population come through the legacy and the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow segregation, not just in the South, but the ways that shaped districting and low investment in the North that had limited opportunity and preparation for this next challenge. And so my ask of those who would look at this and say, this isn't my story, is if you've ever been tempted to comment on what groups are succeeding and what groups are not, this book is for you. But it's not just as simple as they should just work harder. And the ways, one of the things I think is really interesting about the narratives and the stories that we see from white participants is a sense of frustration and loss, right? The idea that the America that I believed I would have, right, is no longer. And again, if you're not Black, they're talking about you too, right? They are saying you, non-white person, are part of the shift in the America that I believed I would have access to, right? Where my life would be better than that of my parents, where the investments that I made would be realized. And there is a frustration there that, again, you would be mistaken to think is only limited to Black Americans. So to understand where we are now and what the future holds, we are in a place where economic vulnerability is the new normal. Recessions are a thing, right, that will come and go. So the ways that we make sense of it and who we blame when things don't go the way we think they should matters for everybody.
Absolutely. And as you said, we are in a totally different world now. This is not the America of our fathers, grandmothers, and beyond. Economic vulnerability is the new normal. So we also have another new normal in terms of the level of DEI backlash that we are facing. And I think many of us are shocked and frightened about this moment that we're experiencing. And so can you talk to us about how do we, on a large scale, approach this level of backlash? Because it's not like we've never experienced backlash, even from Reconstruction. There's always a backlash that occurs when we do advance. But I do think this moment is a bit different because we're in 2024 now. And I mean, I just remember talking to my grandparents and like some of the things that they experienced. It was definitely scary. When they was growing up, a really bad time in America. But I think even if they were living, they would still be probably more frightened sometimes about what we're seeing today, because you would have just never thought that perhaps trying to ban language like DEI would occur in this moment. And so you talked about, dealing with large scale challenges at Rutgers, but I think we need to
Zoom out.
go to a larger scale now as a society.
Absolutely. Although I might trouble your notion, I don't know if they would say this is worse.
And I always like that. I like that pushback.
I don't think they would. I think this moment is loud and uncomfortable. I don't know that I would say it's worse. I think that, let me zoom back. I think a couple of things are happening right now. When we look at the past, right, I'll focus on the civil rights movement in like mid-50s, right? Before we knew it was going to work. There was a breaking point where we're like, this might, right? That was day in, day out, racial terror and violence, lynching and intimidation. If there was the goal of the appeal, the idea of America, again, the things that, in my world, if we told the full story of the American dream robustly, Black people would be at the center of it. Because the way that Black folks have managed to strive forward over and over again is actually the story of promise and possibility. But I digress. The point I was making was about the persistence of progress and retrenchment as kind of the American story. And so post-emancipation, Reconstruction was a beautiful moment. Like it's my favorite part of history to read about. Because again, that possibility was so rich. We survived the worst of it. We were in a new moment. Black elected officials, right? The rising of schools. I mean, it was a transformative moment. And the level of the shutdown that happened after Reconstruction is instructive. Because, and it also goes to this idea that, well, really, no, it's not about race. It has always been fundamentally about race and the idea that Black equality was a threat. And so the conditions, whatever it took to prevent that, we could coexist, but not as equals. Paraphrasing Abraham Lincoln himself. So take us through time from vagrancy code and inequality, or Black codes, even more than that, under the law, the idea of retrenchment, at times violent, and through the institution, right, the state itself, is as American as white bread and apple pie. Fast forward to this moment, 2020, and the racial reckoning and the multiracial masses that took to the streets to call for a different version of America was a powerful, inspirational moment of possibility. Following the election and the re-election of Barack Obama, the ideas of like, wow, right? We're a new America. And yet, no, we're still in America. America's always had these amazing moments that remind us of our promise. We've always had those moments. And I believe we always will. I think our challenge is whenever we have moments of possibility, we forget how constant retrenchment is. Possibility and progress have always coexisted. And so what does it look like for us to prepare as opposed to be surprised? I think that's a really different kind of question. And so I don't think that they would think it's worse. I think one of the things that's interesting about this moment is that we have started to say, with the banning of books and that kind of aim to erase DEI, that if we don't teach them, they won't know. We actually want to change the lens of history itself. It's the most brazen attempt we've had to shift history. We weren't actually doing that before. It's like, it happened, but now we're like, no, we don't even want to talk about the fact that it happened because it makes people feel bad. To me, that's the most ironic rationale. And we're not even hiding it. That's actually one of the explicit reasons. We don't want to teach this in schools because we don't want children to feel bad. So I think that the idea that this is worse, I can't get with it. I think that the challenge of history, what it will mean, the importance of us continuing to tell stories and challenge directly, I think will matter. But I don't think it's worse.
I agree with you. Thank you for correcting me on that. I do agree with you.
Okay.
And, I don't like trying to compare periods, right? I actually should have said worse. So that's the only thing, like, yeah, because I really didn't mean that. So
But
I'm
it can
thank you
feel
for
like
checking
it, right? It can feel, one of the things I think history is really helpful for is it gives us context when those words you've been using throughout. Context for the present, right? A way to situate ourselves. It's not the same. We can't borrow that moment, but it's like, oh yeah, we have been through something like this before. I think to the question of what do we do? What happens now, again, I think history is instructive. The ways that the commonness, the way that we should anticipate distortion. So let's talk Martin Luther King. Most people in America know Martin Luther King and the I Have a Dream speech. One that we call it the I Have a Dream speech to start with. We should have called it I Came to Cash a Check, because that's what he started that speech, right? He said, I do not believe America is bankrupt. I came to cash a check, right? What you promised to Black people. But we don't call it that part. So distortion has always been a part. Part of what's happening with DEI is mass distortion. That we started out with an idea that was inclusive, that really was aiming to say, what does it look like to build educational spaces in a country that has room for all the people in it? And the distortion has been that it's become about race baiting and harm, right, to white people. Again, distortion is something that we should anticipate. The other thing, again, using MLK as an example, is after he saw progress, and again, I'm using air quotes, listeners, you can't see me, right? But there was actual progress, right? Unquestionable, undeniable progress. But the last book he wrote wasn't a happy, yay, we've seen progress book, right? He, despite the progress that he saw, said, not enough, and was really frustrated. And I think the title of that book is instructive for us because the question, the title, for those of you not familiar, is where do we go from here? Right? Chaos or community. I would say to those of us in roles, in institutions, and organizations trying to grapple with what happens next, that question is the question. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? Because those are the options. Okay, you want to do away with DEI? Go for it. What are you going to do about difference? Difference isn't going away. Can't ban it. Can't legislate it away. The set of reasons that created the emphasis on DEI will still be there. So what do? Do we, as higher education institutions that are charged with educating the people, particularly public ones, the people that come to us, do we tolerate disastrously, using that word wrong, we'll fix that. Do we tolerate terrible inequities in rates of success and do nothing to address them? Or do we just blame the differences in identity? Because that would be lazy on our part. What do we do with difference? So you can get rid of DEI, but you've got to do something with difference. Difference is going to show up in ways that shape neighborhoods, that shape school systems, that shape our country. And so the idea that diversity isn't the right word, fine. Do you want to use another one? Sure. What's the question? What will it take for folks to thrive? What investments will we need to make? Let's not get lost in what others have made alphabet soup and miss the issues. And let's pay attention to revealing moments. Pay attention to the moments that are revealing about intention. I talked about Martin Luther King and distortion. And so we've been having this whole conversation about DEI and DEI Backlash and what people say it's about. Pay attention to those moments that are revealing. And so several weeks ago now, when there was a crash into the bridge in Baltimore, and there was a lot of national coverage of the mayor of Baltimore, there were several highlights referring to him as the DEI mayor. Several people captioned it online and said, oh, so that's what we mean by DEI? Right? So we won't say a Black backlash. Right? We won't say we're going to outlaw Black books. We're just going to use DEI as a placeholder. So if you understand the intention of the distortion, then you know how to fight it better. You know how to combat it. And you know not to get caught up in the words and the letters. And think about what does it look like to do work that sustains communities and people and put less emphasis on letters because we don't agree on what they mean. When I use DEI, I'm not using it as a stand-in for Black. That's not the way I'm using it. So, okay, let's use different words so we can get over the confusion. Let's think about what this means. But again, the rush to invest in DEI in 2000 as a response to the reckoning through appointing of people without engagement of the challenge of institutions, I think was a mistake too, right? That it's actually about how do we deal with the ways that inequities have been built into and sustained by our system in ways that a single person or office won't fix. That if we're actually willing to ask those questions, what are our patterns, what are our policies, what are our practices that are creating and sustaining the challenges that we see, we get into a very different kinds of conversations. And a lot of the places that invest in DEI, that we've since seen those offices close, were never interested in those conversations to begin with. So we can actually have a conversation and look at the data, look at the evidence of, okay, is this the places that are responding and kind of shuttering shop now? Are they using the backlash as a convenient excuse to get out of a business they never wanted to be in? And for the places that are interested and kind of digging into the work, their rationale isn't about responding to or engaging in the anti-DEI or whatever we call it conversation, but it's no, this is actually the way that I want to serve the people that I'm responsible for and to. Not about a label, not about alphabet soup. This is literally about the business that we are in. So again, going back to MLK, where do we go from here? Chaos, our community. Those are the choices. And the last piece I'll say on why chaos, our community is so important as a concept for me right now is the question of hostile proximity or community. Because those are the options. We might not all agree. We've talked about it a lot when we message out of our diversity office on campus about the need to kind of nurture and affirm community, right? Not take it for granted. And we might have lots of people say I'm a part of a large campus, but I'm not in community. Okay, you might not want to be in community, but the choice is be a part of a community or exist in hostile proximity. I would prefer community. Doesn't mean we always agree. Doesn't mean we speak and say the same things, but there is a broad recognition that we share space and we want to share it well. Maybe we should expect less and decide that that's actually the new minimum. And it's not this kind of grand notion rooted in kumbaya that never was, but that we can say, okay, we recognize this challenge, this moment is raw enough. In some ways, I think that's the utility of it, that we can reset and come back in and say, what do we want to do? Where do we want to start? How do we go forward?
Excellent, excellent. So I think you just gave us a lot of advice, not only for chief diversity officers, but for many of us who are experiencing this moment now and, quite frankly, not minimizing the stress that people have in this moment and experiencing this moment and living through this moment. But I love that in a different interview that you gave, I heard that you said you are on a quest for daily purposefulness of joy. And so I want you to leave us with that in terms of how can we find joy? What is your prescription to us to find joy as well?
I love it. Joy is a constant. It has to be nurtured. And I talk a lot about Black struggle. And one of the things that for me that I remember and try to hold close to is that Black joy is resistance too. Like the purposeful curation of simple pleasures is resistance too. Again, Black slaves were bred for labor. The idea of joy and quiet moments wasn't a part of what we were given. And so the space to kind of create that, to honor that for ourselves matter, right? We are human beings, not humans doings. And so holding that space to just not do for a while, to allow ourselves to be, that's one of my favorite ways, right? To get some joy in. Even if I can't do anything, right? It's not the #care self-tag or the spa day, both of which I love. But sometimes it's just that simple. To give yourself space to be, sit on the park bench and look at the sun, that no matter what is happening in the world around us, and right now there's a hell of a lot. The sun rose today. It's a beautiful one. And sometimes giving yourself that is enough perspective to find your joy break for the day.
I love that. We are human beings, not human doings. That's a good one. I love it. Thank you so much, Anna, for joining me in the guest chair today. You've given us so much to think about and just so many thoughts of how we even just deal with this moment. And so I think it's so important to just find the joy wherever we can find the joy and our purpose in this moment. To all my listeners, I encourage you all to go out there and get Anna's book, Working Black and White, Struggle for the American Dream, and follow all of the good work that she is doing in her role at Rutgers University and beyond. Thank you for listening to Diversity Matters. If you enjoyed our show and want to hear more, please subscribe to our show, post, talk about, and reshare our show with all of your friends and family, and leave us a favorable rating and review so that it will make it easier for others to find us wherever they listen to podcasts. We cannot do this important work or keep it going without you, so we really appreciate your support. We especially like to thank our episode sponsor, the African American Chamber of Commerce of New Jersey. Please consider becoming a member, support their events and programs, tune into their new show, Pathways to Success on NJTV, and their radio show, The Empowerment Hour, on 920thejersey.com. For more information, please visit their website at www.aaccnj.com. If you or your company would like to sponsor a Diversity Matters episode, please visit the podcast section of our website at www.whconsultingfirm.com for more information. Diversity Matters is produced by WH Consulting, a firm that provides a wide range of management consulting and professional services to individuals and organizations. Original music produced by Sincere Morton Murray. Until next time, peace and love.